The honorable member was saying the budget was music to her ears. My colleague here was saying tra-la-la-la-la, and I don't understand why. Mr. Speaker, more money does not mean better services. And this we have seen over the years, with bigger budgets, poorer services. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member mentioned the DOTS program. But like a lot of the good programs that were there during the PUP civic government, this program was also initiated under then Minister Gail Teixeira. The program grew and in fact became world recognized. Why it was stopped, why it was not happening anymore, only this government can answer. So Mr. Speaker, hearing that we will re-implement, relaunch, or revitalize the DOTS program is good. But we shouldn't have stopped it in the first place. Then we would not have been hearing about an increase in TB. We would not be hearing about an increase in the multi-drug resistant TB. Mr. Speaker, TB is a killer. Worse yet, multi-drug resistant TB is a killer in any part of this world. So I would have loved to hear the Honorable Minister say that we are not going to have shortage of drugs. I would have loved to hear the Honorable Minister say that we would have testing across the country so that we identify, we treat, and people do not become resistant. Because, Mr. Speaker, again I say, multi-drug resistant TB kills. Mr. Speaker, the other point I'd like to find out, the Honorable Minister said the CT scanner in Bartica is well seated in the correct temperature. Mr. Speaker, I'm not interested in that. I want to know if it is working. If people are getting services from this well-seated, correctly temperatured CT scanner. Mr. Speaker, I will deal with the other issues as I continue my presentation. Mr. Speaker, as a geographic MP for Region 6, I must present to this Honorable House the concerns and views of my constituents, who, by the way, spoke loudly at the last local government elections, which can be deemed the midterm elections of Guyana. My constituents have spoken loudly through the ballots. They have said that this government is no good, incompetent, corrupt, and heartless, and not to be trusted to manage their affairs. In fact, Mr. Speaker, my constituents cannot wait for the general and regional elections, which might be much sooner than 2020. Mr. Speaker, today I'm not going to talk about the drug bond deal. Neither am I going to talk about the AGM lab deal. I'm not going to talk about the 14% VAT that this government placed on previously zero-rated items when they had promised to reduce VAT. Mr. Speaker, how come from 0 to 14% can be deemed a reduction? Got to be Jumbie mathematics. I'm not going to speak about giving jobs to party apparatchiks, incompetent though they might be. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to speak about the spiraling crime situation or the tens of thousands of Guyanese nationally who are now without jobs and don't know where their next meal might be coming from or how their children will get food, clothes, and go to school. Mr. Speaker, I will be more specific to my region and my constituents. So I start with the awarding of tenders in my region. I guess a statement made recently that jobs should be given only to members of one party has been an occurrence in Region 6 for quite some time now. The weeding of the road shoulders, for example, was given to contractors from a particular political splinter of the governing coalition. This known to all Barbicians. There are even more incriminating practices going on, Mr. Speaker. Everything seems to be done through selective tendering in Region 6. But the type of selective tendering done warrants both exposure and investigation. This selective tendering, Mr. Speaker, in Region 6 happens in two stages. The first step is that contractors are evaluated after they would have submitted their documents to pre-qualify. Eventually, let us say, for example, Mr. Speaker, 20 are selected as qualified to build bridges. Now, there's the second stage, the second selection, which is done by the REO. The REO chooses a few contractors to whom tender documents will be given. Here is where the corruption happens and where our party apparatchiks and relatives and friends are chosen. I am advised, Mr. Speaker, that this is highly irregular and highly corrupt. So it cannot be right, Madam. In fact, the Auditor General in his 2017 audit said, quoting the Procurement Act 26(1), quote, when a procurement method of restricted tendering is used, the procuring entity shall invite all suppliers and contractors to submit tenders. However, unquote. However, Mr. Speaker, analysis of the Regional Tender Board minutes revealed that a maximum of 4 contractors, and in some instances less than 4, were invited to submit tenders for 140 out of 153 contracts that were reviewed. The sum involved, Mr. Speaker, to these hand-picked contractors was $570.14 million. Mr. Speaker, the Regional Tender Board breached the regulations for the purchase of drugs and medical supplies, again in 2017 report, and in 2018. First of all, in 2017, there were only 2 proven instances when there were actually shortages of drugs and medical supplies for emergency purchases done. This is according to the Auditor General's report. When there are shortages of drugs and medical supplies, it is always made out to be an emergency. That in itself begs the question as to whether the hand-picked managers of this government are sleeping on the job or whether it is deliberate so they can bypass the tender process. Let us look at what the Auditor General said in his report as to how it is done, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to the Auditor General's report, before awarding a contract, the procuring entity shall obtain and compare quotations from as many qualified suppliers and contractors as feasible, but not fewer than 3. However, it was noted that the board minutes dated 5th of September revealed that the administration only requested quotations from 2 suppliers for the supply of 134 items of drugs and medical supplies. It was noted that one of the suppliers did not have 42 of the 134 items, and the other did not have 30 of the items. However, the tender board awarded and approved the suppliers at their quoted prices. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? If we are to look at the prices, here, what do we see? We see, let's take one example, Mr. Speaker. Ciprofloxacin, an antibiotic. At MMU, it is bought for $11 per tablet. The region bought it at $50 per tablet.
Oh my God!
Mr. Speaker, that's not all. You know how many tablets they bought? 15,000 tablets. 15,000 tablets, Mr. Speaker, were bought. And so the region ended up paying over $500,000 more than they would have paid had it been bought by MMU. Mr. Speaker, just a brief word on the sugar workers who were kicked out of their jobs. It would have been amusing had it not been so sad to read the Kaichor News. Quote, according to Prime Minister Moses Nagamutu, the government will pay the final tranche of severance payments due to the more than 3,000 workers before the year ends, thereby keeping its promise, unquote. Promise, Mr. Speaker. This government is famous for observing keeping its promises in the breach. I was asked by sugar workers in Crabwood Creek and the Upper Quarantine to remind the Prime Minister that the workers earned their severance through sweat, tears, and even blood in some cases. It is not something that the government is donating or giving to the workers. Mr. Speaker, the same workers asked me to tell some members over the other side that they will always remember the promised 20% increase that some voted for but never got, the API that this government never gave, and that one of the gravest sins is to take bread out of someone's mouth. Mr. Speaker, I'll move on to health, and then if I have time, I'll come back to rice. Mr. Speaker, I start by asking, where is the CT scanner that was donated approximately 3 years ago for Region 6? The residents of Region 6 surely are not benefiting from it. Remember, storage of that equipment was in the tens of millions of dollars. Still no CT, Mr. Speaker. Where is it, Mr. Speaker? Maybe it is already obsolete. Maybe it needs refurbishing. Maybe it is just not working. This is a travesty, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since 2014, there was a proposal for a health center in the new number 77 housing scheme. The construction was completed and handed over to the regional authorities 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker. Yes, 2 years ago. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? Up to today, that center has not opened its doors to the public. Mr. Speaker, bushes and marabunta and other insects are in that facility. Mr. Speaker, the cost of that structure, $11.8 million. Good job, the party apparatchiks who are running Region 6. Mr. Speaker, on to the Platanka Health Center. Also a brand new facility handed over to the regional authorities over 2.5 years ago. Yes, Mr. Speaker, 2.5 years ago. Still to open its doors. By the time it is ready to open its doors, it will need repairs. The cost to build that building, $14.5 million, Mr. Speaker. I ask this honorable House, is this money well spent? Is this more money, no service? Mr. Speaker, the last budget I said that there were shortages of medicines and medical supplies at New Amsterdam Hospital. It was said that the Honorable Minister visited with a team and found no shortages. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues and myself on the Social Services Sector Committee asked on several occasions through the Parliament to receive copies of the CRIVs for the period in question. This was nearly a year ago. To date, it has not been received. Why, Mr. Speaker? Why? Is there something to hide? I ask. I again say that there are still shortages of medicines across my region, and I dare say across the country. I have seen several prescriptions that patients had to go and purchase medicines, including paying, of course, the 14% VAT on medicines that this government implemented. Mr. Speaker, on to the fleet of ambulances. There were 5 ambulances in 2014. 3 more were added when the Honorable the Honorable George Norton was Minister of Public Health. Makes it 8. Mr. Speaker, where are these ambulances? Where are these ambulances? Definitely not at the hospitals, nor the health centers. I understand, Mr. Speaker, that only 3 ambulances are in somewhat of a working shape. Where are the rest? Mr. Speaker, there is an increase in budget for dietary for 2019 from $91 million in 2017 to $105 million in 2019. Mr. Speaker, let's look. Is this more money, better services? Mr. Speaker, the requested amount is increased, although we have a problem of disappearing food for the New Amsterdam and Fort Canchi hospitals. Yes, Mr. Speaker, there seems to be a mystery that calls for serious investigations. Again, referring to the AG's report, of a sample of 20 payment vouchers, 20% of the food and supplies could not be found. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, what 20% of $91 million would amount to. Mr. Speaker, are we satisfied that there are systems in place for the taxpayers to get value for the money? Are we satisfied that the $105 million to 2019 will be well spent and only the patients are going to benefit? Mr. Speaker, let us look at the performance of the Skeldon Hospital. Same story, shortage of medicines. Same story, shortages of medical supplies. This is in spite of the $400 million budgeted for drugs and medical supplies. This begs the question again, Mr. Speaker, where is the money going? For over 3 months, the X-ray at Skeldon, the rehab department at Skeldon, and the ultrasound machines are non-functional, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these services The patients have to go to a private institution to get these services if they can afford it. Most of them don't go, and they don't go back to the doctors because the doctors require this for diagnosis. Of greater concern, Mr. Speaker, patients and relatives of patients complain to me that on going to the Skeleton Hospital, the staff of this hospital had to use their phone lights in the night to look at patients. Yes, Mr. Speaker, in this day and age, a middle-income country, hand lights are used in a tongue to see patients. What happens in a real serious emergency, Mr. Speaker? Those of us who practice medicine would appreciate the dilemma our colleagues go through, even in these modern times.
You have 5 minutes remaining, Honourable Member.
Firstly, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, why don't we have stable electricity at the hospital? Or is the Skeleton Hospital collateral damage to the closure of Skeleton Estate? Because Skeleton Estate used to provide electricity to the hospital. Is there no planning? Just like the government closed the estate with no plan as to what the workers will do, how D&I will be affected or how the workers will earn their severance. Further, Mr. Speaker, we left a vibrant management committee that had donated a standby generator in case of blackout. Where is that standby generator? Why can't it be used? Why can't it give electricity when there is blackout? I'm sure it kind of reminds me of when I started working in 1990 at the New Amsterdam Hospital. I'm sure my colleagues, Dr. Westford, Dr. Anthony, Dr. Ramsaran will remember those dark days. At the MC8 section, Mr. Speaker, doctors used to be in all the health centers. Now, we are not having the doctors there. Don't know why. Mr. Speaker, let us look at HIV. The minister spoke about HIV. In Region 6, we used to have 50 consular testers in the health system in 2014. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, how many consular testers we have in the government system in Region 6 today? I dare anyone to guess. We have one. He works in Skeleton for 2 days, he works in Port Moran for 2 days, and he works 1 day in New Amsterdam. How are we dealing with HIV? And we are saying we are working towards this great plan. Mr. Speaker, what is going on? The PMTCT is in chaos. The mothers have got to go to the hospital themselves to get tested. Some mothers cannot afford it. Mothers are not educated enough to know that they have to do it. Mr. Speaker, I predict a rise in babies that will be born as HIV positive. Because you know what? The only time some of these mothers know that they have HIV is when they go to the hospital and are ready to deliver, and then they are tested. Mr. Speaker, this is a travesty. Not in this day and age. More money. Where is it going, Mr. Speaker? Where is it going? Mr. Speaker, Ophthalmology Hospital, just quickly. Ophthalmology Hospital used to, up to 2014, 472 cataracts were done. 2017, 2018, zero, Mr. Speaker. Zero.
I remember you have 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, so what is happening with this national hospital that used to see patients from Suriname, from Guyana, from the diaspora, from Trinidad, from Barbados? Mr. Speaker, it is not working. And yet, Mr. Speaker, we see that the Auditor General's report stated in 2017, $18.3 million was spent to rehabilitate this facility. What happened? Zero surgeries, zero cataract, Mr. Speaker. Where is the money going? More money, less service. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say that Region 6 is a representative part of Guyana. And I'm sure the happenings in Region 6 are happening in the rest of Guyana. As such, Mr. Speaker, I can say that this budget is not a people's budget. It does look after some, the elite. To the poor, it gives a little with one hand and takes away a lot more with the next. Why I say so, like my colleague said, we expect 4.6% growth, and yet we expect to collect 10% more in revenue. Mr. Speaker, where would this $30 billion come from? This additional $30 billion. It will be from the poor, from the unemployed sugar workers, from the businessman, from everybody, even the students who are going to university, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker, out of every Guyanese pocket, and the poor man will feel it most. Mr. Speaker, this is another repressive budget. Again, I say, with a clear conscience, and I speak on behalf of my constituents, the overwhelming majority of Barbadians in Region 6, I reject this budget proposal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.